part is basically that we're going to cover is the expert mode for translations. And so these offer some interesting new features that are fairly powerful. But let me jump to a different import configuration to use as an example. So I'm going to make a quick copy of this just to be able to make changes and not worry about affecting my official import configuration. So in this import configuration, if we look at our options, for example, you'll notice that this expert mode for translations has been selected. So that gives us some new features that I mentioned. So let's jump down to a translation that's fairly similar to what we were looking at before, but in expert mode. So if I click on this edit link for my translations, I now see that I have 4 translations that I've set up. And if I pick one of these as an example, for example, let's pick this one here that says is not blank. And one thing you'll notice is that there's sort of this interesting new expression there that we're not used to seeing, and that this sort of token here that says at import value, this is basically sort of an identifier or a token, if you want to use that term, to represent the value that came from our import file. And so this is just another way of saying, but in expert mode, that we want our result value in this translation to be equal to the value that was imported from our import file. Now, the main time that's even more useful, the main reason we show it in expert mode is because it can be used in some other advanced expressions where you need to reference that value from your file. And so one thing to point out about expressions, which is a new powerful feature in translations, is that they always begin with this equal sign. So to look at a more advanced example, up here I can see that I've got some other translations that have some aspects to them that are different than we saw before. So the first is we'll see that this says rather than equals or is not blank, which we've talked about before, as well as is blank, these say starts with. So for example, we have some additional comparison types that are available in expert mode. So now this drop-down list is bigger and it has some additional values. So I can do a translation that just finds a match based on the value in my import file, starting with a certain character or characters, or ending with a certain character or characters, or maybe just containing some set of characters. And so you've got some additional types of comparisons that you can do. In this case, it's basically saying, hey, whenever my import column starts with a less than symbol, then I want to convert it to detection condition of present below quantification limit, and I want my detection limit type to be lower quantitation limit. And then it's got this interesting expression here that says, this is how I want to determine my detection limit value. And this is basically a little formula that's sort of like what you might see in something like Microsoft Excel, where you can put some functions in to get values and manipulate values in a cell. And this is a somewhat similar concept. And so to help explain this and to help create these expressions, there's a little expression builder that can be used to provide some assistance. So over here in the menu, when I'm in expert mode, I have an additional option here that says build or test an expression. So if I pick this option, it basically shows me the expression that's already been put in there previously. And then there's some options here. One is that I can open up a quick reference. So for example, if I click this box, it's going to give me some information about the types of expressions, or rather the types of functions that can be used in an expression, and then a very brief example of how they're used. So this is I can scroll through the list, and as you can see, it's not a long list of functions that have been created at this point. It's a basic set, but they're useful in various situations. And so in this case, you can see I have this equals and then this substitute, which is a function that up here sort of reminds me that this is used to replace existing text with new text. And so what this is saying basically is I want to take the value from my import file, this import value, and you'll see this little @import value again as a reference to the value in our file. And it's saying I want to take that value and then I want to substitute, or I want to replace this less than symbol with nothing, essentially an empty text. And so if we want to test that out, there's an additional feature up here that says, allow me to test this expression. So for example, I can click that box, and now I can, for example, I can test out some expressions. So for, let's say that I put in something like less than 0.25. If I click this test button, it will then show me what the system would do if I were importing a file and I had this value in that column. And so this less than 0.25, it's a reminder once again, it sort of reads like a sentence. It says whenever the import value equals less than 0.25, then this expression here will result in this detection limit value, 0.25. So it's basically a way to manipulate values that are coming in from your file and make changes to them that weren't available before. And so in this case, it basically just stripped off that less than symbol and took the actual numeric value and it's storing it as my detection limit. And that, by itself is just, interesting. But in combination with sort of this whole translation, this is basically saying, well, I'm going to do a conversion where whenever my file has less than value in the import column, I'm going to leave the result value blank in WQX, and instead I'm going to populate these detection limit information and detection condition information, and I'm going to take the value from that without the less than symbol and store it as my detection limit value. So it's complex, it takes some time to learn, and certainly it's not necessarily something everyone will embrace, but it can be a nice feature for those that do a lot of importing and support and want some more advanced features. So to briefly show, and I guess one other thing to mention about this is that this specific example, is just for the purpose of an example. You do have that option of just checking the box in the options on an import configuration, and that will make this specific conversion for you. But there's lots of other types of conversions that can't be done for you that now these new expressions can. So some brief examples before we end the conference call. Here's a scenario where we want to provide an attachment, so some sort of document that we're going to link to our activity. And in that case, you have to provide WQX with a file name for that attachment and a type, which basically the type is just the extension on that file name. So, if you had a file that was your, an image like a JPEG or something, that file extension, or JPG for example, would be used as your attachment type. Well, if you don't want to have to keep putting that in your import files every time, you can create an expression that does that for you. So if I glance really quickly at this example, this is saying, well, whenever I have a value that's not blank in my file, then I want to take the value that's in this column in my file and I want to store that as the attachment file name here. But then I want to use this expression to basically calculate or create the attachment type. So if I quickly jump into the builder, I can see how that works very quickly. Say, allow me to test this expression. This is using the split function, which basically is something that will take your value and split it based on some character in that value. So in this case, it's a period. So what this is saying is I want you to split the value and give me the second part of that after splitting it. And so if I had something that was, my picture.jpg, I test this expression, it will show me that it's going to take JPG and put it in as my attachment type. So using this expression basically solve that for me, and I don't have to keep putting those extensions in my import file. Another couple quick examples, just for those advanced users that are interested. Here's maybe an example with a activity group. We want to provide an activity group ID in our file so that we can group various activities together. And what this is saying, if I go into my translations, that, let's pick one here for example, this is saying whenever the value in my column starts with QC, then I want to create an activity group whose type is QC sample. And then I want to use that actual value in my import file as the activity group ID. So what this means is that maybe I could create some sort of convention in my file where I want to create activity groups of different types, and if they start with QC, I'm going to create QC sample activity groups. And if they start with R, for example, I'm going to create a replicate. So this is basically using this starts with in combination with these expressions to basically tell it, a number of new conversions that you couldn't do before. Whereas just by using the letters at the beginning of my activity group ID, it will determine the type of activity group I want to create. So that's, probably sufficient to give an idea about the types of things that you can do. One reminder is that the user guide addendum shows some additional examples and give you a refresher if you are interested in trying some of these new features. That is essentially everything that I had to cover. There's really just a few minutes left, but if anyone has a quick question before we end the call,